All right, everybody. First submission in my followers swing review session is Danny, who struggles with a lot of pull draws and snap hooks when his timing is not quite there. First thing to reference right off the bat, the camera angle is a little high, which typically makes things look more shallow than they actually are. I just want to reference that for everybody who's watching, okay? So a lot of Danny's problems, we're actually going to jump ahead here, actually go back to the top of the backswing. So yes, he hits a lot of pull draws. You can assume his path is very inside out. A lot of flippiness at the bottom. That's usually a pretty common theme of golfers who hit pull draws. What you can see here from him is the combination of swing obviously gets very long, but it's not so much the long swing that's the problem. It's that he is in a severe amount of lead wrist extension. I would call this a little bit on the extreme side. And when you get that cupped with the wrist and you combine it with a little bit of some internal shoulder rotation, which you can see from this bent elbow and kind of like the elbow flying a little bit, this causes the club to get very across the line. So what do we know about being very across the line is that a lot of times, especially with that much cupping to the wrist, is that early into the downswing, you're going to be very steep and very narrow because of the top of the backswing. And that is going to cause a golfer like him to then shallow the club a lot later. Now it's a full speed video, so it gets very blurry, but pretty clear here where the club head is tracing very underneath the plane, right? This happens because he had to shallow the club really late from that narrow position. And that just causes his hands to have to flip at it when he's under it to try to save it. So when he's on, he can draw it really nicely. When he's off, he can obviously hit a bunch of snap hooks. So he's got to change this alignment here if he wants to get better. Reduce the amount of lead wrist extension you have. If you flatten that wrist out even a little bit, it'll start to work the club more down the plane line as well. So he can actually fix two things at once. And if he wants, he can remove some of that internal shoulder rotation. So all of the top of the backswing alignments, to me, set the tone for all of the issues that he deals with later. All right, so video number 2, we have my man Liang out from Australia. Liang told me that he struggles with a lot of push slices. Now, in his case, once again, like the first golfer, and like you're actually going to see with golfer number 3, it's going to be a lot of backswing issues. Believe it or not, this tends to be a theme with a lot of the lessons I give, is that a lot of the issues that golfers will struggle with later on in their golf swing tend to stem from being really out of position on the way back. So I'm going to highlight his hand path here. What you are going to see is not a lot of hip turn early on. Now, some people might say that this takeaway looks pretty good because the club head is outside the hands and the face angle is a little bit toe down here, which is pretty solid. What I don't like, though, is exactly what I'm highlighting, which is the fact that he has a hand path that works very upwards for the first half of his backswing. Now, there are some high-level golfers who do this. If you ever look at Rory, Rory is not somebody who has a super inward hand path right off the bat. You can see with this particular golfer here, he doesn't have a big hip turn, so naturally his hands are more likely to work up as opposed to around. But the problem is that they never really work very deep, right? They never really actually change. So he keeps his hands over his toes of his feet for way too long into the backswing here. And then by the time he gets to the top of the swing, combination of, the club is starting to set a little too late off. His arm plane gets very up above his shoulder plane, but doesn't really get his hands very deep. A lot of this has to do with that very disconnected takeaway where his hand path was working upwards. And then from here, even though the club changes direction at the top, in large part because of that right arm kind of collapsing and getting narrow, right? When that right arm collapses over, trail shoulder will internally rotate. It'll shift the club more across the line, which is fine. It's him trying to manage the movement of the shaft at the top. But the problem is that from here, even if he reroutes the club and tries to shallow it really well, because of his lack of hand depth at the top, the hands just get way too far out in front of him, makes it very, very difficult to shallow the club. So he comes down to vertical. And then from here, he actually rotates decently well. So the club just kicks outside the hands. And then he swings 2 down and left on the ball. So overall, his pattern is actually quite solid, if I'm being honest. There's some unique tendencies involved. But really, his biggest issue to me is the fact that he's got to open up his hips a little bit earlier into the backswing to really start to get those hands working around him, so that by the time he gets to the top of his swing, his arm plane can be a little bit wider, a little bit deeper, and a little bit better structured in this area, which would help him on the way down to keep the hands and club a little bit more inside so that he's not so steep on it. Lastly, we got my man Joshua, who also struggles with a lot of snap hooks and blocks. And his issues are going to be somewhat similar to the first player, but not quite the same. So again, camera height, a little bit too tall for my liking. It's going to make things look a little bit more shallow. But what you're going to see with him, takeaway looks pretty structured, not a whole lot of forearm rotation, club face in a pretty good spot, hand path works inside pretty good, hinges the club up really nicely right around this point, hand path very neutral position in the middle of his chest, shoulder tilts look good, pelvic tilt, all that looks good. Now when he gets towards the top of the backswing, because of how he hinges it a little bit later here and adds a little bit of some internal shoulder rotation late in the backswing, the club does set a little across the line. Now, the difference between this and the first player is that this is not nearly extreme. You know, this is a very subtle across line position. It's super manageable. Lead wrist is a lot flatter, so it's not nearly the same extent as the first scenario. The difference with him is that this golfer has a really big pull down effect, and that to me creates all of the problems he experiences. So you're going to see where his hand path gets here, and then in transition, there is a lot of speed from the hands down very vertically. So what happens when golfers pull down on the club? Well, number one, the hand path is going to get stuck too deep into the downswing because of all of that speed that the hands carried, and it happens typically in a very downward fashion. But then number two, when you do pull down on the club, because the hands are traveling so fast, the body can't keep up. So your whole sequence kind of gets thrown out the window. And then when you pull down on the club, especially from a slightly across the line position, even though the top of the backswing wasn't so much of an issue positionally, the pull down effect from there creates this extremely vertical shaft. So now his hands are too far inside, the club is too steep. What is he going to do? He's going to try to shallow it out really late. He does it through some forearm rotation. It does get the club inside, but obviously he's just going to be stuck in that scenario. And to be fair, this is a high-level player. You can tell from his mechanics, he actually manages that pull down as good as a golfer probably can do, but obviously you have to reduce that effect. So he's got to work on a lot of chest-specific movements in transition, trying to leave those hands alone, trying to reduce the pull down and get the hand path working outwards. If he wants to help it even further, he can actually weaken the grip a little bit. We've done a lot of tests, and typically when the club is in the palm of your hands, it's a lot harder to pull down than when the grip gets a lot stronger and it's in the fingers. So if you weaken the grip a little bit, it would help him. It wouldn't guarantee it, but it would help influence a little bit less of a pull down, and then combine that with a lot of chest rotation drills to influence the hand path more outwards as he's leaving the hands alone. And slowly over time, you get rid of a pull down. When it's this extreme, like this player has here, where obviously you can kind of see how severe it is, it's not going to get changed overnight. It's not going to be fixed in one shot, but the continuation of working on the same thing for a long period of time is what would help this player get better.